The moment I told Margaret Thornfield that she couldn't use her lake anymore, I watched 40 years of entitled arrogance crumble in real time. She stood there on the dock she thought she owned, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at my weathered cabin, and screamed words I'll never forget. "You can't do this to me. I am this community." But I could do it, and I did. My name is Robert Matthews, and I'm about to tell you how the most controlling HOA president in Pine Valley history discovered that the lake she'd been regulating, the dock she'd been restricting access to, and half the waterfront properties she'd been collecting fees from actually belonged to me. This is the story of how a family secret buried in dusty legal documents brought down a tyrant who thought she owned the world, one violation notice at a time. It started with my grandfather's fishing cabin and ended with me holding the deed to an entire lake. But the journey between those 2 points nearly destroyed me, and it taught me that sometimes the people who shout the loudest about rules are the ones breaking the biggest ones of all. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a place where the water runs deep and the secrets run even deeper. Pinecrest Lake sits like a sapphire in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by towering pines and the kind of pristine wilderness that developers dream about. My grandfather, William Matthews, built his cabin there in 1948, when the area was nothing but forest and fishing spots, known only to locals. It was a simple place, 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that faced the water. Grandpa had built it with his own hands, every board and beam chosen with the care of a man who understood that some things are worth doing right. The dock stretched 30 feet into the lake, sturdy enough to hold 3 generations of Matthews men teaching their sons to fish. I inherited the cabin 5 years ago, along with memories that felt more valuable than gold. Summer afternoons, casting for bass. Winter evenings by the fire, listening to Grandpa tell stories about the old days. The smell of coffee brewing at dawn before we headed out in his aluminum boat. What I didn't know I'd inherited was a fight. The Pine Valley Lake community had grown up around Grandpa's cabin over the decades. What started as a few scattered homes had become an exclusive development of million-dollar properties with manicured lawns and private beaches. The Homeowners Association had formed in the 80s, and by the time I inherited the cabin, they were running the place like a small kingdom. Margaret Thornfield was their queen. She lived in a sprawling colonial that dominated the South Shore, complete with a private boathouse and what she called her entertainment pavilion. At 73, Margaret had silver hair that never moved in the wind and a voice that could cut glass when she was displeased, which was often. I first met her 3 weeks after I moved into Grandpa's cabin permanently. I'd taken early retirement from my job in Charlotte, ready to spend my golden years fishing and reading on the porch. I was painting the cabin's shutters forest green, the same color they'd been for 50 years, when she appeared like a storm cloud on legs. "Excuse me," she said, though it sounded more like a royal proclamation than a greeting. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Pine Valley Lake Community Association. We need to discuss your property." I climbed down from the ladder, paintbrush still in hand. "Robert Matthews. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Thornfield." She didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, she pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what looked like a very long list. "Your cabin is not in compliance with community standards," she announced. "The paint color hasn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Your dock is 6 feet longer than regulations allow. And that boat." She pointed at Grandpa's old aluminum fishing boat like it was a personal insult. "Motorboats under 16 feet require special permits." I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. "Ma'am, this cabin has looked exactly like this for 70 years. My grandfather built that dock with his own hands." "Things change, Mr. Matthews. We have standards now. Community regulations that everyone must follow." She handed me a thick packet of papers. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance, or you'll face fines. I flipped through the packet that night, my coffee growing cold as I read rule after rule. The dock could be no longer than 24 feet. All exterior paint must be approved by the committee. Forest green was not on the approved color list. Boats under 16 feet required annual permits and inspections. Even my grandfather's old weather vane, which had pointed north for half a century, was classified as an unauthorized decorative element. The rules were comprehensive, detailed, and completely at odds with everything that made the cabin feel like home. But I tried to comply. I really did. I spent 3 days scraping off the forest green paint and replacing it with colonial beige from the approved color palette. I filed paperwork for my grandfather's boat, including photographs, registration documents, and a $50 permit fee. I even took down the weather vane, though doing so felt like erasing a piece of my grandfather's memory. None of it was enough. 2 weeks later, I found another violation notice taped to my door. The beige paint was inconsistent with neighboring properties. My boat, despite having a valid permit, was improperly secured because I'd tied it to the dock with the same rope my grandfather had used for decades instead of HOA-approved marine-grade line. The American flag that flew from my porch, the same flag that had flown there since 1976, was suddenly a non-conforming display. I called Margaret directly, hoping to resolve the issues person to person. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've followed every rule in that packet you gave me. I don't understand what else you want me to do." "Mr. Matthews," her voice was ice cold through the phone, "compliance isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding that we have a certain standard of living here. Your property represents the past. We represent the future." What's that supposed to mean? It means that sometimes, for the good of the community, changes need to be made. Perhaps you'd be happier in a community more suited to your lifestyle. The way she said lifestyle made it clear she wasn't talking about my retirement plans. That's when I realized this wasn't about paint colors or dock lengths. This was about Margaret wanting my land, and she was using the HOA as a weapon to get it. I just didn't know yet that she was fighting a war she'd already lost before it started. Summer turned to fall, and Margaret's campaign against my little cabin intensified like a storm building over the mountains. Every week brought new violations, each more absurd than the last. My mailbox was 3 inches too tall. My outdoor thermometer required a weather instrument permit. Even the bird feeder that had hung from the oak tree for 30 years was suddenly an unpermitted wildlife attraction device. Each violation came with a fine, $25 here, $50 there. But they were adding up, and more importantly, they came with deadlines that seemed designed to be impossible to meet. Replace your mailbox within 48 hours. Remove unauthorized bird feeders by tomorrow. Install regulation house numbers using approved fonts within 24 hours. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning when I woke up to find my dock wrapped in yellow caution tape. A notice posted on the post declared it unsafe for public use, pending a structural inspection that would cost $800 an inspection that could only be performed by contractors approved by the HOA. I called Margaret immediately. "This is ridiculous," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. "That dock has been standing solid for 70 years. It doesn't need an $800 inspection." "Mr. Matthews, we take safety very seriously in this community. If you can't afford to maintain your property properly, perhaps you should consider selling to someone who can." There it was. The real agenda, finally out in the open. "I'm not selling, Mrs. Thornfield." "We'll see about that." She hung up, and I stood there staring at my phone, realizing that this woman was never going to stop. She was going to fine me, harass me, and regulate me until I gave up and walked away from everything my grandfather had built. That afternoon, I drove to the Pine Valley Municipal Building to file a complaint. The clerk, a friendly woman named Janet, listened to my story with growing sympathy. "Oh, honey, you're not the first person to have trouble with Margaret Thornfield," she said, pulling out a thick file. "She's filed complaints against half the original property owners around the lake." Original property owners? The folks who've been there since before the HOA was formed. She seems to think they should all be held to the same standards as the new developments, even though most of them have grandfather rights. Grandfather rights. The phrase stuck in my mind as I drove home. That evening, I went through my grandfather's old papers more carefully than I ever had before. Most of it was routine stuff: utility bills, tax records, correspondence with friends. But at the bottom of an old shoebox, I found something that made my heart race. A letter from a law firm, dated 1983, regarding something called mineral and water rights retention. The language was dense and legal, but certain phrases jumped out at me: perpetual ownership, exclusive access, and lakefront development restrictions. I read it 3 times, not quite believing what I was seeing. According to the letter, my grandfather hadn't just bought land for his cabin. He'd bought something much more significant. The next morning, I called the law firm mentioned in the letter. Hendricks, Bailey and Associates was still in business, though the original partners had long since retired. The current senior partner, a woman named Sarah Hendricks, agreed to see me that afternoon. "Mr. Matthews," she said, studying the letter I'd brought, "this is fascinating. I remember this case. My father handled it before I joined the firm. Your grandfather was quite the shrewd businessman." "I don't understand." "Shrewd how?" Sarah spread out a large map of Pinecrest Lake across her desk. "In the 1940s, your grandfather didn't just buy the lot where his cabin sits. He bought the entire lake." My mouth fell open. The entire lake? Mineral rights, water rights, everything. When the area started developing in the 70s and 80s, he sold off parcels of land around the shoreline, but he retained ownership of the actual lake, the lake bed, and specific water access rights. She pointed to various spots on the map. Every dock, every boat launch, every swimming area technically, they're all on your property. I stared at the map, trying to process what I was hearing. "But the HOA, Margaret acts like she owns." "She owns her house and her lot," Sarah interrupted. "But the dock she uses to launch her yacht, the beach where the community holds its summer parties, the boat slips that homeowners pay monthly fees for, those are all on lakebed that belongs to you." The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of Sarah's desk, trying to steady myself. Why didn't my grandfather ever tell me this? From what I remember, he was a private man who didn't like confrontation. As long as people weren't causing problems, he was happy to let them use the lake. "But, Mr. Matthews," Sarah's voice became very serious, "if someone has been harassing you about your property rights, you have legal standing to restrict their access to the lake entirely." I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling with possibilities. Margaret Thornfield, the woman who'd been trying to drive me away from my grandfather's cabin, had been using my lake for decades without permission. Her precious yacht was moored at my dock. Her community beach parties were happening on my shoreline. Her HOA was collecting fees for boat slips that sat on my property. And she had no idea. But I was about to change that. The next few weeks were a blur of legal research, property surveys, and sleepless nights. Sarah Hendricks had agreed to represent me, and together we dove deep into 70 years of property records, HOA documents, and lake usage agreements. What we found was astounding. My grandfather's original purchase in 1948 had indeed included the entire lake, 847 acres of water, plus mineral rights and exclusive authority over water access. When Pine Valley Lake Community was developed, the builders had somehow failed to secure proper water rights from my grandfather. They'd simply assumed that buying shoreline property included lake access. They were wrong. "This is unprecedented," Sarah told me during one of our meetings. "I've never seen a case where an entire lake belongs to a single private owner while dozens of homes surround it. Your grandfather essentially created a legal time bomb." So what does this mean, practically speaking? It means you have the right to control who uses the lake and how. Every dock, every boat, every swimming area, you can grant or revoke access as you see fit. I thought about Margaret's yacht, her community dock, the monthly slip fees she collected from homeowners. What about the HOA? Can they continue to collect fees for boat slips? Sarah smiled grimly. "Not on your property, they can't. In fact, if they've been collecting fees for access to your lake without your permission, you might have grounds to sue for damages." The legal implications were staggering, but the personal implications were even more significant. Margaret Thornfield had spent months trying to force me away from my grandfather's cabin, not realizing that I owned the very foundation of her power in the community. I decided to conduct a little test. That Saturday was the annual Pine Valley Lake Community Fall Festival, a fancy affair where residents gathered on the community beach for wine tasting and boat tours. According to the HOA newsletter, it was Margaret's favorite event of the year, a chance to show off the community to potential buyers and remind everyone who was in charge. I walked down to the beach around noon, just as the festivities were getting started. Margaret was holding court near the main dock, directing volunteers and greeting guests with the kind of gracious authority that came naturally to her. She spotted me approaching, and her face immediately hardened. "Mr. Matthews, this is a private community event. HOA members only." "Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, I think there might be some confusion about what's private around here." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a warning whisper. "Don't make a scene. These are important people. Important people using my lake without permission." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Your lake? Mr. Matthews, you really need to understand your place in this community." "I understand it perfectly. The question is, do you understand yours?" Before she could respond, I pulled out my phone and called Sarah Hendricks, who was standing by as we'd planned. "Sarah, it's Robert." "Yes, I'm at the community beach now. Could you explain to Mrs. Thornfield here exactly what property she's standing on?" I held the phone toward Margaret, putting it on speaker so the gathering crowd could hear. "Mrs. Thornfield," Sarah's professional voice came through clearly, "you are currently standing on private property belonging to Mr. Robert Matthews. The beach, the dock, and the lake itself are all owned by Mr. Matthews under a deed filed in 1948. Your community has been using his property without permission for decades." The color drained from Margaret's face. Several guests had stopped their conversations to listen. That's impossible. The HOA owns the lake access rights. We have documentation." "You have documentation showing that you bought land around the lake," Sarah interrupted. "But you never purchased water rights or lake access from the actual owner. Mr. Matthews' grandfather retained those rights when he sold parcels to developers." Margaret grabbed my phone. "This is some kind of scam. Some kind of legal trick. Ma'am, I can fax you copies of all relevant documents within the hour. The deed is public record, filed with the county clerk in 1948. Lake ownership has never been transferred." I took my phone back and ended the call. Margaret stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "This isn't over," she finally managed. "I'll sue you for fraud, for harassment, for whatever it takes to prove you're lying." "Feel free," I said calmly. "But in the meantime, you might want to think about how you're going to explain to all these homeowners that the boat slip fees you've been collecting are for slips on someone else's property." The crowd had grown larger, and I could hear murmurs of confusion and concern. Margaret looked around at the faces staring at her, many of them people who'd paid her thousands of dollars in HOA fees over the years. "Everyone, please," she called out, trying to regain control. "This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding. Mr. Matthews is obviously confused about property boundaries." That's when I played my trump card. "Mrs. Thornfield, would you like to see the survey results?" I pulled out the official property survey that Sarah had commissioned a week before. It showed the lake boundaries clearly, with my property lines encompassing the entire body of water. "According to this legal survey, completed last week, your dock extends 43 feet into my lake. Your yacht is currently moored on my property. And this beach where we're standing? Every grain of sand below the high water mark belongs to me." The silence was deafening. Margaret stared at the survey documents, her hands shaking. "You can't do this," she whispered. "You can't just... People have rights. They've been using this lake for decades." "Without permission," I pointed out, "which means I can revoke their access at any time." And that's exactly what I did. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Word had spread throughout Pine Valley Lake community like wildfire. The lake they'd all been using, the water their expensive homes were built around, apparently belonged to the quiet man in the old fishing cabin. The community center was packed beyond capacity. Homeowners who rarely attended meetings filled every chair, with others standing along the walls. The air crackled with tension, fear, and barely contained anger. Margaret sat at the head table, flanked by the other board members and a lawyer she'd flown in from Atlanta. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone fighting for their life. I arrived with Sarah Hendricks and a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice strained but determined, "we're here tonight because of an outrageous claim that threatens the very foundation of our community. Mr. Matthews has alleged that he owns Pinecrest Lake, but I assure you this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to extort money from honest homeowners." A murmur of agreement ran through parts of the crowd. These were people who'd invested millions of dollars in lakefront property, and they desperately wanted to believe that their investments were secure. Margaret's lawyer, a stern man in an expensive suit, stood up. "We've conducted our own research into Mr. Matthews' claims, and we believe they are based on outdated documents that have no bearing on current property ownership. The Pine Valley Lake Community Association has held legitimate title to lake access rights for over 30 years. He gestured toward a stack of documents. "We have surveys, deeds, and title insurance policies that clearly establish community ownership of lake access rights. Mr. Matthews' grandfather may have owned the lake in 1948, but property law is complex, and ownership can be transferred through various legal mechanisms over time." The crowd was with him. I could feel the hostility in the room, the desperate hope that this lawyer could make their problem disappear. Sarah stood up. "Your Honor, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to present evidence to the contrary." She began spreading documents across the table at the front of the room. "These are certified copies of the original deed filed by William Matthews in 1948. As you can see, the property description includes not just the land where his cabin sits, but all water rights, mineral rights, and exclusive access authority for the body of water known as Pinecrest Lake." She held up another document. "This is a survey commissioned by our office last week, conducted by a licensed surveyor who has worked in this county for 20 years. It confirms that Pinecrest Lake, in its entirety, sits within the property boundaries established by the 1948 deed." Margaret's lawyer interrupted. "These documents don't prove current ownership. Property rights can be lost through abandonment, adverse possession, or other legal mechanisms." "Actually," Sarah continued smoothly, "they can't. Mr. Matthews' grandfather paid property taxes on the lake every year until his death. His family has maintained exclusive ownership without interruption. There's no legal basis for claiming abandonment or adverse possession. She pulled out another stack of papers. Furthermore, when the Pine Valley Lake community was developed, the builders never purchased water rights from Mr. Matthews' grandfather. They assumed that buying shoreline property included lake access, but assumption is not ownership. The room fell silent. Margaret's face had gone pale. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been collecting dock fees, maintaining the lake, operating as if you owned it," Sarah finished. "But you don't. You never did." That's when the real shouting started. "This is fraud," someone yelled from the back. "We've paid thousands in dock fees," shouted another voice. "What about our property values?" Margaret banged her gavel frantically, trying to restore order, but the crowd was beyond control. People were on their feet, voices raised, demanding answers she couldn't provide. Through the chaos, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. Something in my posture must have commanded attention, because gradually, the shouting died down. "I understand you're all scared," I said, my voice carrying easily through the now quiet room. "You've invested your life savings in homes around this lake, and now you're being told that the lake itself belongs to someone else." Heads nodded. These were good people mostly, who'd worked hard for their piece of paradise. But here's what I want you to understand. I never asked for this fight. I inherited a simple fishing cabin and wanted nothing more than to spend my retirement in peace. It was Mrs. Thornfield who started this war, with her violation notices and fines and threats to drive me away from my family's land. I turned to look directly at Margaret. "You spent months trying to force me out, not realizing that you were standing on my property every time you threatened me." Margaret's lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she ignored him. "You can't do this to these people," she said, her voice cracking. "They're innocent. They bought their homes in good faith." "You're right," I agreed. "They are innocent, which is why I'm prepared to offer something you never offered me." The room held its breath. "I'm willing to grant easement rights to every current homeowner for lake access, dock usage, and recreational activities. No fees, no restrictions, beyond basic environmental protection." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. "However," I continued, and the room tensed again, "there are conditions. First, the HOA will cease all harassment of property owners who don't conform to your artificial standards. Second, all current fines and violations against existing property owners are null and void. And third, Mrs. Margaret Thornfield resigns as HOA president immediately." Margaret shot to her feet. "You can't dictate HOA leadership. That's not how this works." "Actually," I said calmly, "I can dictate who has access to my lake. And people who've been harassing my neighbors and trying to steal my property don't qualify for lake privileges." The room was dead silent. Every eye in the place moved between Margaret and me, waiting to see who would blink first. Margaret looked around at her neighbors, people she'd controlled and commanded for years, searching for support. What she found instead were faces filled with calculation. They were weighing their loyalty to her against their need for lake access. The math wasn't in her favor. "Fine," she said finally, her voice bitter with defeat. "You want to destroy this community? You want to tear down everything we've built here? Fine. But don't expect gratitude when property values collapse and this place becomes a free-for-all." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, then stopped and turned back to face the room. "You'll regret this," she said, looking directly at me. "All of you will regret this." Then she was gone, and with her went 40 years of HOA tyranny. The months that followed, Margaret's resignation were some of the most peaceful I'd ever experienced at the lake. Without her constant harassment and arbitrary rulemaking, the community settled into a natural rhythm that felt more like a neighborhood than a dictatorship. True to my word, I granted easement rights to all the existing homeowners. People could use their docks, moor their boats, and enjoy the lake just as they always had. The only difference was that now they were doing it with permission instead of assumption. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Frank Morrison, was everything Margaret wasn't. Where she had ruled through fear and fines, he led through cooperation and common sense. The violation notices stopped. The arbitrary fees disappeared. People began to actually enjoy living at Pine Valley Lake Community instead of simply enduring it. I kept my grandfather's cabin exactly as it was, forest green shutters, weathered dock, and all. Nobody complained about the paint color anymore, and my grandfather's old aluminum boat sat proudly at the dock where it belonged. But the biggest change was in how my neighbors treated me. Before the truth came out, I'd been the troublemaker, the old man who wouldn't follow the rules. Now I was the guy who'd saved their property values and their lake access rights. People waved when they saw me fishing. Kids asked if they could help me tend my grandfather's bird feeder. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down, started bringing me fresh tomatoes from her garden. "I should have spoken up when Margaret was harassing you," she told me one afternoon. "We all should have. Thank you for being stronger than the rest of us." The only person who wasn't adjusting well to the new reality was Margaret herself. She'd moved out of her colonial mansion within a month of the meeting, selling it to a young family from Charlotte who were thrilled to own lakefront property without the drama. Word around the community was that she'd relocated to a gated community in Florida, where presumably she could find new people to regulate and control. But she left behind a legacy that took months to unravel. Sarah Hendricks helped me sort through decades of HOA financial records, and what we found was disturbing. Margaret had been collecting boat slip fees for slips that sat on my property fees that legally belonged to me. Pool maintenance fees for a community pool that was also built on my land. Even parking fees for a boat launch that was entirely within my property boundaries. The total amount she'd collected over the years was staggering, nearly $200,000 in fees for the use of property she didn't own. "You have grounds for a significant lawsuit," Sarah told me. "She's been operating what amounts to a business on your property without permission or compensation." I thought about it for weeks. The money would be nice retirement funds, college savings for my grandkids, maybe even some upgrades to the old cabin. But pursuing Margaret legally would mean more lawyers, more meetings, more drama. In the end, I decided to let it go. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. Instead, I did something my grandfather would have approved of. I used my newfound authority over the lake to create the William Matthews Memorial Fund, dedicated to maintaining the lake's natural beauty and providing scholarships for local kids to attend summer camp. Every time someone pays their voluntary contribution to the fund instead of mandatory HOA fees, I think about my grandfather and smile. He would have loved knowing that his lake was bringing joy to children instead of stress to adults. The irony of the whole situation isn't lost on me. Margaret spent years trying to drive me away from a modest fishing cabin, not realizing that I owned the very thing that made her mansion valuable. She collected fees for access to my property while fining me for not conforming to her standards on my own land. But perhaps the deepest irony is this: if she'd simply been kind, if she'd welcomed me to the community instead of trying to control me, none of this would have happened. I would have been happy to let things continue as they always had, with neighbors enjoying the lake that my grandfather loved so much. Instead, her greed and arrogance cost her everything she thought she owned. These days, I spend my mornings fishing from the same dock my grandfather built, watching the sun rise over water that legally belongs to me, but spiritually belongs to everyone who's ever found peace here. The lake is still the same pristine wilderness it was when Grandpa first cast his line into these waters, but it's also something more now, a reminder that sometimes the best response to a bully is simply to outlast them. Margaret was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about one. I did destroy her community. The community of fear, fines, and forced compliance that she'd built around my grandfather's lake. What grew in its place was something much better, a real community, where neighbors help each other instead of harassing each other, where differences are celebrated instead of regulated away, and where the lake serves its true purpose as a place of peace and natural beauty. Every evening, as I sit on my porch, watching the sunset paint the water gold, I raise a glass of sweet tea to my grandfather's memory. He bought this lake to find peace, and in the end, his wisdom and foresight gave me the power to create peace for an entire community. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property, it's the knowledge that the people who came before us were looking out for us in ways we never imagined. And sometimes, the best revenge against those who try to steal your peace is simply to outlast them and turn their weapons into gifts for others. Margaret Thornfield thought she owned my lake, but as it turned out, my lake owned her. That's my story, how the HOA president who tried to control my grandfather's fishing cabin discovered she'd been living on my lake all along. It's a reminder that property records matter, that kindness costs nothing, and that sometimes the person you're trying to push around might be the one person who has the power to push back. If you enjoyed this tale of lake justice and HOA karma, served ice cold, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories of neighborhood drama, property disputes, and the kind of poetic justice that makes you believe the universe has a sense of humor. Hit that notification bell too. You won't want to miss what happens when an HOA tries to fine someone for having too many flowers, or when a Karen discovers that her perfectly manicured lawn is actually growing in a designated wetland. Until next time, remember to check your property deeds, be kind to your neighbors, and never underestimate the power of an old fishing cabin to change your entire world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next story.